There are things people don't talk about on a first date, and there are things people never talk about at all. They keep them tucked away somewhere deep inside between their ribs and only bring them out when they know for sure. This person isn't going to run away. So I've reached that point. And now I want to tell you everything. Not because I need to get it off my chest, but because this story deserves to be heard, because it's real, and because it's mine. I'll start from the very beginning. From that September morning when I was standing in the elevator of a skyscraper in Manhattan and realized that life is an unpredictable thing. I was 23. I had just graduated from college in Ohio and arrived in New York with a single suitcase, a laptop, and that naive feeling that the big city was just a big village, only with a subway. I rented a room in Brooklyn from a couple who were renting out a corner room for a song, on the condition that I wouldn't fry fish in the kitchen. We agreed. I actually couldn't cook much back then. I lived on sandwiches from the deli on the corner and coffee from paper cups. I landed an internship at Meridian Group through a friend of a friend. Not the most glamorous route, to be honest, but at 23, you don't really have much of a choice. The main thing was to get a foothold, to add a line to my resume, to understand how this city works, these offices, these people in suits who talk on the phone right out on the street, and still manage not to walk into lampposts. First day, 8:47 a.m. I'm standing in the lobby of a building on Madison Avenue, looking at the floor directory, realizing I need to go to the 9th floor, and stepping into the elevator. The elevator is already almost full. People with coffee, with folders, with that characteristic New York expression that means, "I'm here, but I'm not here." I squeezed my way to the back wall. The doors closed. And that's when he got in at the next stop. I didn't notice him right away. The elevator was packed. There were a lot of people. Everyone was silent, staring at their phones. It was just that at some point I sensed someone very tall standing nearby, and that this person smelled in a way that made me want to close my eyes and just breathe. Not overpowering, not cloying, something deep, warm, with wood and something else I couldn't identify at the time, but later learned was oud. Arabic perfume. Very expensive. The elevator jolted. Someone behind me pressed a button. The crowd shifted slightly, and I found myself pressed against this person more tightly than I was comfortable with. Or, comfortable isn't quite the right word. More like, than I was ready for. Because I felt something else. Something that made me stare at the floor and pretend I was studying the pattern on my shoes. I didn't know where to look. I didn't know what to think. I stood there just trying not to move or blush. The latter didn't come easily to me. And then, quietly, almost in my ear, he asked, "9th floor?" His voice was low, calm, without inflection. Not a flirt, not a question, just words. But I felt them somewhere around my solar plexus. I nodded. Yes, the 9th. The doors opened on the right floor and we stepped out together. I looked back and only then got a proper look at him. A tall, broad-shouldered, dark-skinned man in his 50s with a ponytail, wearing a perfectly tailored gray suit. He was staring straight ahead. He walked with confidence, like a man who knows that every inch of this building belongs to him. I walked up to the reception desk. I said I had an interview. I gave my name. The woman behind the desk smiled and said, "Someone will come to meet you." I sat down on a small sofa, placed the folder with my resume on my lap, and waited. About 5 minutes later, an assistant came out and led me into a conference room. It was large with glass walls overlooking Madison Avenue. And there, sitting at the table, was he, Terrence Wilson, CEO. The very same man from the elevator. I think I just stood there in the doorway for about 3 seconds, looking like someone who'd just been hit on the head. He looked up, looked at me, and something flashed in his eyes. Not a smile, something subtler. Recognition, perhaps. And a kind of calm, very mature amusement. "Have a seat, Jake," he said. I sat down and began the interview. I don't remember exactly what I said. I remember trying to sound smart. I remember him asking questions, specific, to the point, without any fluff. I remember looking at him and thinking, this man sees right through people. Not because it was scary, but because you could feel it. He listened as if the words carried weight. At the end, he said he'd let me know in 2 days. He shook my hand, firmly, confidently, and I left. They called the next day. I was hired. For the first few weeks, I tried to be invisible. Well, not completely invisible. I worked, did everything I was told, didn't show up late, didn't skip lunch, but in the sense that I tried not to cross paths with Terrence without a reason. Because every time we ran into each other in the hallway or at a meeting, I felt strange. Not bad, just strange. As if something in the air was changing. The temperature, maybe. He would sometimes stop and ask how I was doing. Not just out of politeness, he really asked. He listened to the answer. Once he said he'd noticed my analysis of the project. Good work, he said. Keep it up. I was walking down the hallway then and thought I must be losing my mind a little because those words made me feel better than any exam grade ever had. Weeks went by. October. The city had changed. Leaves on the trees in Central Park. The cold air, the smell of roasted nuts from the carts on the corner. I began to feel like I belonged here, little by little. And then came that Friday. The whole department left around 6. The project for the new client was stuck at a stage that needed to be wrapped up by Monday. I stayed behind. I volunteered because I wanted to show I wasn't afraid of work. And I found I wasn't alone. In the far corner of the open space, a light was on, and there sat Terrence with his laptop and a stack of papers. We exchanged glances. He nodded. Sit down, let's figure this out together. And we figured it out. We worked for about 3 hours, I guess. He explained the structure. I did the calculations. We argued about one section. He insisted on one approach. I suggested another. He thought about it and said, "Okay, try your version." I tried it. It worked. He looked at the screen and said, "Good job. Just, well done." 2 words. But I felt as if I'd just been awarded a prize. Around 10 o'clock, he stood up, opened the bottom drawer of his desk, and took out a bottle of whiskey. It was a 20-year-old, I found out the brand later. He set it on the table and took out 2 glasses. I honestly told him I hardly ever drink. He looked at me, not judgmentally, just curiously, and said, "1 glass won't kill you," to the completed project. I drank it. The whiskey was heavy, warm, and smelled like something very old and very expensive. And just 1 glass made me tipsy. Seriously, I wasn't used to it. My head felt light, and I started talking more than usual, laughing at my own words. Terrence watched me with that calm, slightly mocking look of his. Then he asked, "How are you getting home, by subway?" I said, "Yeah." He glanced at his watch and said it was almost 11. And taking the subway at that hour wasn't the best idea given my condition. He offered to drive me home. Or, if I wanted, he had a guest room. I could stay the night and we'd go to work in the morning. I agreed to stay in the guest room. I don't know why. Or rather, I do know. I just didn't want to leave. His apartment was on the Upper East Side. It was large and peaceful, with high ceilings and books everywhere. On the shelves, on the windowsills, on the coffee table. It was such a quiet apartment, a grown-up apartment. He showed me the guest room, clean sheets, a towel, everything just right. He said goodnight. I lay down and passed out instantly. I woke up to the smell of coffee. My head felt heavy, but not as bad as I'd feared. I lay there staring at the ceiling, thinking about the fact that I was in my boss's apartment, and that it was probably strange, but for some reason it didn't feel strange to me at all. I felt good, warm, just like home, even though it was my first time in this apartment. I got up, washed my face, and went into the kitchen. Terrence was standing by the window with a mug. He was wearing plain pants and a shirt, no jacket. It was the first time I'd seen him like this, not in work mode. He turned around and nodded toward the coffee machine. "Help yourself." I poured some coffee. I sat down at the bar table. We started talking. First about the project, then somehow naturally shifted to other things. He asked about Ohio, about college, about how I ended up in New York. I told him. And the longer we talked, the more I realized that the person in front of me wasn't just a boss. He was a person, a real complex person with a story. He grew up in the Bronx, went to college on a scholarship, and built a company from the ground up over 20 years. He talked about it simply, without any fanfare, as if they were just facts, not achievements. I looked at him and thought, this is what a person looks like who knows what he wants, and always has. And then he said something, I don't remember what, something funny about how I looked that morning, and I laughed. And he laughed. And at that moment, something changed. Not abruptly, it just shifted. As if we both realized at the same time that we were no longer talking as boss and intern, but simply as two people who feel comfortable with each other. He looked at me. I looked at him. The pause lasted 3 seconds, no more. And then he kissed me. And then we had sex right there in the kitchen. So much so that we almost missed work. It would have been awkward to be late together during our first few weeks at a new job, you have to admit. Although, to be fair, we would have been late for a very good reason. I thought about that moment for a long time afterward, trying to understand exactly what had happened. Not in a physical sense, I understood that perfectly well, but in an inner sense. What had shifted? Because it wasn't just an impulse, a moment, a coincidence. It was something I'd probably been feeling all along, ever since that first elevator, that first 9th floor, but hadn't let myself name. It was too scary to name, because once you name it, it becomes real. And I was afraid of the real. But now, it had become real, all on its own. In the kitchen, over coffee, on a Saturday morning. I won't pretend I wasn't panicking then. I was. While we were riding in the taxi, he'd called a cab, we'd stopped by my place to pick up my things, I sat there thinking, what on earth was that? What now? How to act at the office? Is this even normal? Or did I just do something that will ruin my career before it even began? Terrence seemed to sense it. He didn't say anything dramatic. He just looked at me and said, work is work. Everything else is separate. If you want. I did, and we got started. I wanted to, and we started. At first, I didn't understand at all how it worked. Being with someone and pretending at work that nothing was going on. It seemed like it was written all over my face, that everyone who looked could see it right away. I'd walk into a meeting, sit down at the table. Terrence would come in last, always last, it's a habit. And I'd stare at my papers with such intensity as if the secrets of the universe were written there. I gradually got the hang of it. It's like a muscle. You train it and get used to it. Work is work. We were professional, even perhaps more distant than before, precisely because we tried not to give anyone a reason to suspect anything. He didn't single me out and I didn't bother him without a reason. Everything was strictly business. But there was one moment, somewhere in late October, when we bumped into each other in an empty hallway near the conference room. Literally nose to nose. No one else was around. He looked at me. For a second, no more. And there was something in that look that made me feel my temperature rise. Just a look. He didn't do anything. He walked past. I stood there in the hallway for another 3 seconds thinking, so this is how it happens. When your head spins from the gaze of a man in a suit. Our dates were quiet, almost like being at home. We didn't go to clubs or have dates with flowers and candles. That would have been ridiculous. We just spent time together. Sometimes he cooked. He was good at simple things. Pasta, fish, something with rice. I learned to cook by watching him. I tried to copy him. It turned out worse, but he never laughed. Only once did he raise an eyebrow when I oversalted the soup and said, an interesting interpretation of the recipe. On weekends, we sometimes went to Central Park. We just walked. He knew the park well. He grew up in the Bronx and said that as a child, the park seemed like another world to him, out of reach. Now it was his favorite place for Sunday walks. We walked, sometimes in silence, sometimes talking. He told me about the city, its history, its neighborhoods, its people. I listened. I liked listening. There was one Sunday in November, cold, gray, already distinctly autumnal. We were sitting on a bench by the pond, and he suddenly said that he had been lonely for the last few years before I came along. Not in the sense that he had nowhere to go or no one to talk to. In a different sense. In the sense that when you come home, there's no one to tell how your day went. No one to just be there. I didn't know what to say. I just said that I understood. He looked at me and said, I think you do understand. We sat there a little longer and then went home. To his home, which was gradually becoming mine too, slowly, imperceptibly, like everything that matters. December brought snow and holiday bustle to the city. Christmas lights on the streets, crowds on Fifth Avenue, the scent of Christmas trees at the flower shops. I've always loved this time of year. There's something childlike about it that can't be erased. Terrence and I went to see the Christmas tree at Rockefeller Center. He said it was a tourist trap, but agreed to go because I asked. We stood in the crowd looking at the lights, and he took my hand. He just took it. Without looking back, without thinking, he just did it. I felt something inside click into place. It was the first time I thought the word love, not out loud, just in my head. And I wasn't scared. January was spent working and planning. February brought a conversation about my parents. And now, March, Ohio, that dinner that didn't go as planned. We left in early March, a flight, then a 2-hour drive. The whole way I kept thinking about how it would go. Terrence was calm. He's always calm. It's one of the things about him that I find both admirable and a little infuriating. I was nervous for both of us. My mom's house, 2 stories, the suburbs, a garden. She met us at the door, hugged me, then turned to Terrence and said, "Nice to meet you, I've heard about you." I thought to myself, what? What had she heard? It turned out I'd mentioned his name in conversation without thinking about it. Mom notices everything. Dad came out of the living room, shook Terrence's hand, firmly, appraisingly. We sat down at the table. For the first 20 minutes or so, everything went normally. Conversation about New York, about work. Mom asked about the office, about the company. Terrence answered calmly and politely. I ate and thought, maybe this will go smoothly. Then Dad asked point blank, "Do you work together?" "Yes," I said. "And a little more than just working." The pause was so long that I could hear the clock ticking in the hallway. Dad stood up. I remember how he stood up, slowly, as if he were struggling to get up. He looked at me, then at Terrence, then at me again, and he said, "You ruined the party." His voice was quiet. It was worse than if he had been yelling. Mom didn't say anything. She sat there staring at her plate. I don't know what she was thinking. She didn't look up. Terrence stood up. He looked at Dad, calmly, without anger. He said he understood, that this was unexpected, that we could talk if they wanted to. But for now, if they asked us to leave, we would leave. We were asked to leave. We left that same night. At the airport, I didn't say a word. Terrence didn't pressure me. He didn't ask how I felt, didn't say everything would be okay. He just sat there beside me. On the plane, I looked out the window at the dark sky and thought, that's it. I've just lost my family. Or have I? Or can this be fixed? Or maybe Dad, he loves me, he always has. He just wasn't ready. Does he need time? I didn't know. I went to sleep when we got back to New York and woke up feeling like something inside had broken. Not badly, but like a crack in a window. You can only see it if you look closely. The next few weeks were strange. At work, everything was fine. We're both professionals. At home, that is at Terrence's because I was basically living with him, it was fine too. But inside, I carried it with me. My parents didn't call. I didn't call. It was like a wall of silence, and no one wanted to be the first to break through it. I thought about Dad, about how he'd always been. Strict, but fair. He was never the kind of person who said, "I love you," every day, but he always came to my college games, always helped with my studies, always answered my calls. That was his love language: presence, action, reliability. And now he was gone. He had passed into silence. I wasn't angry with him. It's probably strange, but I wasn't angry. It hurt, yes, but there was no anger. Because I understood. He wasn't ready. That doesn't mean he's a bad person. It means that life hadn't prepared him for that kind of conversation. In his world, everything was different. And I was breaking that map of the world, simply by existing. One evening, Terrence said to me, we were sitting after dinner late at night. He was reading something, I was staring at the ceiling and clearly lost in my own thoughts. He put the book down and said, "You don't have to convince them. You just have to be honest. The rest is up to them." I said, "But what if they don't take that path?" He paused. Then he said, "Then that's their choice. And it hurts. But it's not your fault." Easy to say, harder to live with. I kept working. I focused on tasks. That always helped. Numbers and structure were a way to stop thinking about what hurt. I went to the gym. That was new too. I started in October. Terrence had casually suggested it. He had a membership at a gym near his house. Gradually, it became part of my week. Physical exhaustion drowned out the emotional noise. In April, I wrote to my mom. I waited. I just wrote that I missed her, that I was sorry things had turned out this way, that I didn't want to ruin her birthday, that I understood this was all unexpected, but that I was asking her just to give me a chance to explain. Not now, when she was ready. She didn't reply right away. 3 days of silence. Then, a short message. I hear you. Give me time. It wasn't everything's fine, but it was something. Meanwhile, life went on as usual. Work, the city, spring in New York. It's different. Not like in Ohio, harsher, more urban, but beautiful in its own way. Trees in bloom along the streets, people on the open terraces of cafes, the smell of warm asphalt. I began to feel that New York was mine, once and for all, irrevocably. Terrence and I, we were becoming something more than just dating. I officially moved in with him. That is, I packed up all my things from Brooklyn, vacated the room, and stopped paying rent. It just became obvious at some point that we were living together, and pretending otherwise was pointless. For him, it was easier. He had an adult daughter from his first marriage. They were on good terms. She lived in Los Angeles and worked in design. When he told her about me, she wrote, "Send photos." Then, when we met via video call, she told me that Dad finally looked truly happy, and that she was glad, and that if I ever hurt him, she'd fly out and deal with me personally. She said it with a smile, but I knew she wasn't joking. June. I'd been working at Meridian for almost a year. I was no longer an intern. I had a real job and a decent salary. Things were starting to fall into place, not just at work. In the summer, Mom called first. We talked for a long time, probably an hour. She didn't say, "I understand everything," or "I've figured it all out." She just said she wanted to meet up, that she wanted to see me, and, after a pause, that she'd probably like to get to know Terrence properly, not like last time. I asked about Dad. She said, "He's working on it." We met in August, in New York. Mom flew in alone. We walked through Central Park, ate at an Italian restaurant, and she watched Terrence, studying him, sizing him up. He was just himself, calm, attentive, not trying too hard to impress. He was simply there. I think that's what worked. Mom doesn't like it when people try too hard to impress. She trusts those who are just themselves. At the end of the evening, she took my hand and told me she loved me, that was what mattered most, that she would learn to accept the rest. I almost burst into tears right there in the restaurant. I held it together, barely. In the fall, exactly a year after that elevator incident, Terrence said one evening that he wanted to go out somewhere, to a restaurant, a nice one. I asked, "What's the occasion?" He said, "Just because." The restaurant was on the top floor of one of the buildings in Midtown. The view of Manhattan, the lights, the bridges, the dark ribbon of the river. We sat down, ordered, and talked. I looked out the window and thought about how a year ago I'd been standing in that elevator with a suitcase, having no idea what was coming next. Then Terrence took a small box out of his pocket. He placed it on the table. He opened it. Inside was a ring, simple, platinum, without any frills, just like him. He looked at me and said, "I'm not going to give a long speech, just, do you want to?" I said, "Yes." He put the ring on. We continued our dinner. I think someone at the neighboring tables saw everything, but at that moment, I didn't care at all. I called my mom that same night. She said quietly, "I'm happy." Then, after a pause, she added, "Tell Dad yourself." I called Dad the next day. He picked up the phone. That was something in itself because he hadn't answered a few times before. I said, "Dad, Terrence and I are going to get married. I want you and Mom to be at the wedding." He was silent for a long time. Then he said, "I'll think about it." It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no. We started planning the wedding. Nothing too fancy. Terrence didn't like a lot of fuss, and neither did I. A small garden outside the city, 50 people, everything simple and lively. His daughter was flying in from Los Angeles, a few of his old friends. My friends from college, the ones who'd stuck with me all the way to this point. Planning the wedding is a whole other story. I thought it would be simple. Find a venue, make a guest list. Done. Nope. There were the flowers. We seriously spent an hour debating what kind of flowers to get. Terrence said he didn't care. Then it turned out he did care. He didn't want lilies because they smell like a funeral. Okay, no lilies. There were negotiations with the restaurant about the menu. There was music. Jazz, of course. Otherwise, Terrence wouldn't have agreed. There was a moment when I sat for an hour trying to write a short speech for the ceremony. Something personal, from the heart. And I couldn't, because everything sounded either too pretentious or not enough. In the end, Terrence sat down next to me, read what I'd written, crossed out half of it and said, "Leave this. It's honest." Honest. That was his key word. Not pretty, not correct. Honest. We sent the letter to our parents 2 months later. It was simple. "We're getting married on such and such a date. We'd love to have you there. No pressure, no strings attached, just an invitation." The reply was a long time coming. I checked my email every day. At first, several times a day, then less often. Then I learned not to check at all. It's like waiting for test results. The less you think about it, the easier it is. Then Mom wrote, "We'll try." 2 words. We will try. That means both of them. That means Dad, too. I closed my laptop, stood up, and went to the kitchen. Terrence was cooking something there. I told him. He turned around. He looked at me. He nodded. He didn't say anything, he just nodded, like a man who knew it would happen this way, who was just letting me come to this conclusion on my own. And so, the wedding day. It was a cool September morning. The garden had already begun to turn yellow, the very beginning of autumn. The leaves were still clinging on, but already had golden edges. I stood and watched as they arranged the chairs, as someone hung up the garlands, as it all transformed into a place that in a few hours would become a part of our story forever. Terrence came up behind me, stood beside me, and looked out at the garden. I said, "It's beautiful." He said, "Yes." Guests began to arrive around noon. I greeted them, hugged them, said something. I don't remember the details very well. Everything was like a light fog. A pleasant fog. The kind that happens when something important is taking place, and your brain tries to remember everything but doesn't know where to start. And then, about 20 minutes before it started, I saw them in the crowd, Mom and Dad. They were standing at the entrance to the garden, Mom in a light-colored dress, Dad in a jacket. Both looked a little lost, like people who had come to a place they weren't sure they were supposed to go, but had come anyway. I walked over to them. Mom hugged me first, tightly, the way you hug when you haven't seen each other in a long time. I smelled her perfume, the same as always, and something tightened in my chest. Dad was standing nearby. I looked at him. He looked at me. Then, he didn't say anything, he just hugged me. Briefly, tightly. That was enough. The ceremony went exactly as I wanted it to. Nothing extra, no words, no rings, just that moment when we looked into each other's eyes and I thought about that elevator, that Friday, that morning in the kitchen, everything that had happened between then and now. Afterward, dinner, music, conversation. I glanced over at my parents a few times. They were sitting at a table with a few guests, talking. Dad said something to Terrence. They happened to be next to each other, I didn't hear what. Terrence laughed. Dad did too, just a little, cautiously, but he laughed. At the end of the evening, Mom said, "We'll try to accept it. Not right away, but we'll try." That was enough. It's been 2 years since the wedding. I'm 25, Terrence is 56. We live in the same apartment on the Upper East Side, only now it's officially ours. I work somewhere else. I left Meridian after a year and a half. We both knew that sooner or later we'd have to do it, just so there wouldn't be any questions, from us or from others. Now I'm at a small analytics firm, and I'm happy there. Sometimes I wonder, what if I hadn't agreed to stay in the guest room that night? What if I'd taken a taxi and gone home to Brooklyn? Everything would have been different. Or, no, maybe nothing would have changed. Maybe we would have found this path anyway, through some other moment, another conversation. I don't know. I'm not sure it matters. What matters is what we have now. We have dinner on Fridays. It's become a tradition. Not at restaurants, at home. He cooks, I set the table, we eat slowly and talk. About work, about the city, about what we're reading, about our plans. Sometimes we just sit in silence, and that's okay too. Silence with someone you feel comfortable with isn't emptiness. It's fullness. His daughter came to visit last Christmas. It was the first time we met in person. Before that, we'd only seen each other via video chat. She came with a friend. We spent a few days together, visiting museums, eating at restaurants, watching movies at home. She turned out to be funny, sharp-tongued, very much like her father. The same calm gaze, the same habit of phrasing things precisely. We hit it off right away. As she was leaving, she said to me, "Thank you for making sure he's not alone anymore." I didn't know what to say. I replied, "I'm not alone anymore either." My parents came to visit last spring. It was their first time at our place in New York. Mom walked around the apartment, touching everything with her hands, as if she wanted to make sure it was all real. She looked at the books, at the photos on the shelf, at the kitchen, and there was something in her face that I find hard to describe. Not anxiety, more like understanding, as if she saw that I was living a normal life, that I was doing well, that this was real. Dad sat down at the bar table, the very one where it all began, though he didn't know it, and started asking Terrence about the business. They talked for about 2 hours. I sat nearby and listened as Dad joked, cautiously, but he joked, and Terrence responded in kind. About markets, about clients, about how the business has changed over the past 20 years. Dad works in construction, a completely different field. But people who've built something from scratch always have plenty to talk about. At one point, they laughed at something. I didn't catch what it was. It was just that they both laughed in unison, and it was so unexpected and so natural that it took my breath away for a second. Dinner was for 4. Mom brought an apple pie recipe and baked it right there in our kitchen. The smell filled the whole apartment, that very same childlike, homey scent. Terrence later told me quietly that it was the best thing that had happened in that apartment in all the years he'd lived there. I believe him. They left the next day. Mom hugged me at the door, a long, wordless hug. Dad shook Terrence's hand, then mine. Then, already in the elevator, he turned around and said, "Call more often." I call more often. I looked at that table, at Mom, at Dad, at Terrence, and thought about that elevator. About 8:47 in the morning. About the scent of expensive perfume in the crowded elevator. About that voice, "Ninth floor?" About how life sometimes doesn't go the way you planned, but the way it's supposed to. I don't know how to end stories like this properly. Probably not at all, because they don't end. They just go on. Every day, little by little. Jazz playing in the background in the kitchen. Coffee in the mornings. Laughter over something silly. Silence where nothing needs to be explained. Dad joking with my husband about building codes and stock market indices. Mom leaving a recipe on the fridge with a note, "Don't forget to add cinnamon." That's what it is. Mine. I thought long and hard about whether I should even tell anyone this. It's not a simple story. There's age, status, and what I had to go through with my parents. People might not understand. They might judge. They might say, "You're too young, he's too old, it's an unequal union." But here's the thing. I've lived 25 years, and for the first time, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. For the first time, without that feeling that I don't quite fit in, that I'm a little different, that I'm living my life a little wrong. Terrence didn't turn me into a different person, but by his side I became myself, the person I've always been, only I didn't let myself admit it before. Maybe that's exactly the main point I wanted to make. Everything else is just details, beautiful, vivid, real details. But this is what matters most. I've found my place, and the person in it, and it's forever. You know, sometimes in the mornings when he's still asleep and I'm already up, having poured myself some coffee and standing by the window watching the city wake up, I think about that intern with the suitcase who arrived in New York and had no idea what was in store for him. About how he stood in the elevator and blushed. How he tried to be invisible during those first few weeks. How he didn't know where to look. I'd like to tell him, "Don't be afraid. Everything will be okay." Not right away, not without pain, but okay. Really okay. He probably wouldn't have believed me, but I know.